Today, there's a desperate need for intensified criticism of the left from anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-capitalist points of view. Ripe for examination are community organizing groups, community-based agencies, and the nonprofit sector as a whole, all of which practice almost consistent anti-unionism and commitment to livelihoods entrenched in disciplining parts of the class, parceling out poverty, and channeling anger and activity into highly controlled forms that are important for maintaining the current balances of power. The Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, ACORN, briefly mentioned in promissory notes, is a great example of a group that has not only relied on a highly exploitable workforce, but also sought to control and channel working class energy toward the Democratic Party, especially in a time of global capitalist crisis. Intense honesty about the class interests and loyalties of the institutional and radical left has been a major strength of Midnight Note's work for decades, and we believe such an analysis is still important. In the current crisis, we think it might be worthwhile to ask not just why the class is decomposed, but also how it is currently controlled and how it is organizing and rebelling. What forms has capital created to control resistance and movement here in the United States? After all, it was Midnight Notes who decades ago, after concluding that the left had abandoned the class, argued that, quote, the class will again have to bypass its left as it did in the 1960s, unquote. The situation now, of course, is that the right has had immense success in building power, at least partially through grassroots and community organizing, and the strength of the right is far beyond anything in the left in the States. Moving back to promissory notes, Midnight Notes and Friends' discussion of inside and outside struggles more or less evades the question as to whether struggles can be broadly conceived of without analysis of the ways in which capital has in fact institutionalized community organizing, particularly in the form of services and advocacy, but also in the particular kinds of explicit organizing, as key to its functioning. We don't think that we can use an inside-outside dichotomy, nor presume that the institutions of each essentially have rebellious characteristics or even complement each other. Perhaps most of the time they don't. ACORN, for example, is a capitalist institution. Organizationally, its role isn't dissimilar from the UAW during the 1960s. It has played an important role in grassroots organizing in the States for years. On a larger level, the class interests of foundations as well as nonprofit bureaucrats are not those of the working class. Rather, generally speaking, they might be much more similar to the class interests of the premature green capitalists involved in the anti-nuclear movement that Midnight Notes analyzed and critiqued 3 decades ago. This isn't simply sectarian leftist nitpicking. As groups from facing reality to Midnight Notes have taught us, we need to be very attentive to the progressive and left institutions that play key roles in controlling class and channeling it into capitalist strategies. Only now, at a time of historic ecological destruction and right-wing development in the United States, the stakes are frighteningly high. Okay, I'm going through. Okay. Am I talking at a slow enough pace? I get nervous sometimes and need to be really quickly. With this said, we do not want to imply that if folks are working in the system, they are automatically enemies of the class or any such reactionary argument. To try and flesh this out, we'll briefly turn to another example from an article published in Midnight Notes more than 2 decades ago, entitled Spatial Deconcentration in D.C. The essay Spatial Deconcentration was written by radical anti-gentrification organizers in one of the most disenfranchised spaces in the nation, and took as its premise that housing and urban development was an institution of the capitalist state, which was deeply invested in maintaining white dominance. At that time, the authors argued HUD's strategy of providing Section 8 vouchers to those living in public housing and requiring voucher recipients to move to the suburbs of Maryland was analyzed as a way to prevent struggle. The article pointed out how, quote, many of the grassroots housing groups in Washington are dependent on Section 8 contracts for their survival and will refuse to recognize and discontinue the role they play in the program, unquote. Today, many of the nonprofits that play a key role in the inside that Midnight Notes discusses takes contracts with HUD or other government agencies and implement their programs across the nation. While the particulars when you obtain a Section 8 voucher might be different, if you can ever hit the top of the waiting list, the situation of HUD's role in gentrification has continued, and the state's role in co-opting grassroots energies have substantially increased, along with that of the private foundations. Many agencies take foundation grants that require tight control on the types of work being done with clients. These groups become immersed in funding regimes that preclude confrontational organizing, which has historically been the key mechanism for building working class power. And their loyalties become first and foremost to the capitalist state, while they simultaneously operate as key players in policy work and frontline work of service delivery. They provide key resources that people need to meet the continually lowered bar of what's acceptable to live, but they also reinforce current class dynamics by avoiding organizing efforts that may substantially challenge current power relations, among other means. To elaborate further, the popular view that the inside groups are doing what they can within the neoliberal context misses the point that they are, in fact, a major part of the, quote, left-wing of capital on the ground. The service providers, community-based agencies, and community organizations. They play a key role in the crisis in the US, and we need to understand them if we were to understand how and why the class is reacting under the crisis. We are not arguing that these groups are the problem, but we are arguing for much more nuanced analysis of their role in the crisis in the post-Keynesian period, and particularly in the current crisis. Through this analysis, we might understand better why the explicit struggle against the crisis in the US has been hard to find, as well as address the ways in which the class has utilized, subverted, and challenged the nonprofits, much as it has done with the unions for decades. Regarding the outside groups, we have less to say, but we suggest that these groups and their class interests must also be seriously analyzed. The radical left in the US has become increasingly entrenched in activist identity politics, which essentially sees activists as the new vanguard of struggle against exploitation and oppression, and often moves from a sort of classless angels approach. Here we simply wish to state that activist identity groups in the US have only in exceptional situations sought to ground themselves in community struggles for better daily lives and working class power. It may be that some of the most exciting developments are to be found in groups that avoid inside or outside approach, but rather engage many approaches in their struggles. In understanding contemporary struggle, we hope for an analysis that takes autonomous activity into account, and this may mean going back to examining the smallest of transgressions. On a macro level, one example of this was found in promissory notes in George and Sylvia's essay, Must the Molecules Fear as the Engine Dies? By taking on debt far beyond its many in the class engaged in a serious struggle, though in a seemingly non-coordinated way. This kind of argument needs to be weeded out and expanded. We can see in the US consumer debt crisis a class deal that is collapsing under its own weight, but we've not given sufficient credit to the termites. The relationship of the US working class to credit is an important element of class composition and deserves the militant examination and empirical political economy that we encountered in Midnight Notes' earlier years. On a micro level, one wonders what we might find if we look into small-scale, non-explicit forms of struggle and resistance in the US in recent years. Workplace thefts and terminations due to insubordination, amongst others. George Warwick, an important thinker in the development of autonomous Marxism, argued decades ago in an analysis of slave resistance that under slavery, as under any class, and as under any social system, those at the bottom were not totally dominated by the master class. They found ways of subverting the worst of the system and even at times dominating the masters. We do not wish to dehistoricize responses to slavery, but we do want to draw attention to Warwick's mention of any other social system, including neoliberal capital. How are people responding to the crisis beyond the resistances that are easy to understand? When it is hard for us to understand responses to the crisis, we need to be open to questions of resistance beyond what we're used to. Because, as Warwick argued, the victim is always in the process of becoming the rebel, because the contradictions demand this resolution. Where in the United States are we becoming rebels today? We think that Midnight Notes can help guide us through these questions as they have for 30 years. We also want to emphasize, I'm almost done. We also want to emphasize that there are many long-term radical community organizing efforts occurring around the states, some of which evade the inside-outside dichotomy. These groups are engaged in campaigns that have made a concrete impact, and more crucially, shown us how resistance cannot simply attack the crisis as such. That is, struggles are ongoing and grapple with the before and during of the crisis, such as the realities of gentrification, the prison industrial complex, and sexual violence. We've tried to inquire into the development of some of these initiatives in our own work, but no, we have barely touched the tip of the iceberg. Moreover, these struggles clarify our own methods of inquiry and analysis. That is, we, all of us in this room, have tried to speak through the left for a long time. It is our challenge right now to figure out how to speak around it. In conclusion, we offer the above comments with humility and humbleness as a part of a discussion on Midnight Notes. We also offer sincerest congratulations. Few groups on the radical left in the US can sustain 30 years of collective effort and intervention, or anything else for that matter. More important, however, few groups in the US have been able to consistently offer substantially useful insights over 3 decades of time. Cheers to 3 decades on and 30 years hence, unless we hopefully win first.